Nolan Asch, who used to be a neighbor of mine, he lived 4 doors away, and he's retired and enjoying himself, I think, in Morristown. Anyway, he has asked me to give him a short little bio, and I'll read it to you. He is one of very few official national Alexander Hamilton advocates per the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, abbreviated AHA. AHA was one of only 3 historical consultants in the Lin-Manuel Miranda used in the 6-year project, which culminated in the 2015 smash Broadway musical Hamilton. And with that, Nolan, take it away.
We're going to talk about the Constitution. Before I begin talking about the Constitution, I'm going to beg you and plead with you, as Ben Franklin did in Philadelphia in 1787. I'm just going to ask one consideration when we get to the Q&A. Please do not ask me any questions about how the Constitution applies to current controversies. We have something called the United States Supreme Court. They decide what's constitutional and what's not. So if I get any, I want lots of questions, but if I get any speeches or questions like that, I'm just going to say next speaker and you'll be muted. But now let's get down to business. To fully develop a deep understanding and appreciation of the United States Constitution, you need to understand the events. And I do this when I'm live. I can't do this on Zoom, but I usually like to dramatize lots of things. This is the first thing I really want to dramatize. One of the few things you need to remember. To understand the Constitution, you have to understand the events before, during, and after the May 1787 to September 1787 meeting in Philadelphia, we now call the Constitutional Convention. Believe me, folks, they didn't call it that then. So when I say before, we're starting at Yorktown, October 1781. So that's before, until the meeting. But let's go all the way back. Let's go back to 1776. 13 separate nation states called colonies declared their independence from England and would have to fight for their independence. From 1776 to 1787, that whole period, there were only 2 interstate or multi-state organizations at all: the Continental Army and the Continental Congress. And Washington and the Continental Army, scrupulously reported to the Continental Congress. And the so-called government was the Articles of Confederation. Now, under the Articles of Confederation, the Continental Congress had no power to do virtually anything. They had no power to tax. They had no power to raise money. They had no power to do anything without getting permission from at least 9 of the 13 nation states. So all during the Revolution, they had to beg nation states for funds and resources. This is why George Washington and his army was almost always underfed, underclothed, undersupplied, starving to death, and freezing to death. Famously at Valley Forge, but 2 winters here in Morristown, and every winter. In 1780, even before Yorktown, my buddy Alexander Hamilton wrote to his friend, close friend, John Duane, there's a street named after him, in Manhattan, quote, "Our so-called government is fit neither for war nor peace." Now, let me try to dramatize this point. Does anyone out there really believe there is a United States of Europe headquartered in Brussels and the EU really runs all of Europe? Any of you believe any stupid thing like that? You don't believe that France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and all the 27 EU nations are not sovereigns? They are not subordinate to Brussels. So let's go back to 1783, right after Yorktown. 13 nation states had just won their independence from England. Now, this was a 6 or 7 year war wherein 1% of the population was killed. Let that sink into your head. Only one other war in American history exceeded this death toll as a percentage of the population, and that was the Civil War, and they both had been fought on American soil. Here's a true story that should be somewhat revealing. When the news of the Yorktown victory was delivered from Yorktown to the Congress in Philadelphia, the messenger was a service like FedEx or UPS. He needed to be paid. There was no money in the treasury to pay this guy. Some rich person, probably Ben Franklin, paid him out of his own pocket. New York had its own currency, its own legal system, its own foreign policy. New York had a treaty with France. New York had a treaty with England. New Jersey and the other states all had the same degree of sovereignty. Now, the Continental Congress had its own currency. It was called the Continental. Quote, "Not worth a continental" was a common phrase in those days. The Continental traded on open markets at 1 cent to 3 cents on the dollar. At least the EU does have a common currency, the euro. The EU has low or no trade barriers between nation states. Not so with the 13 nation states. Before the Constitution, if you tried to sell a good made in Connecticut in Pennsylvania, you could and would be stopped at the New York border and probably taxed and tariffed. When you got to the New Jersey border, you would be taxed and tariffed again. When you got to the Pennsylvania border, you'd be taxed and tariffed again. Sometimes even wars were fought between the nation states. You can look it up in Wikipedia, the first Pennamite War and the second Pennamite War. Connecticut somehow came to own a part of Pennsylvania near Scranton. After Yorktown, Connecticut wanted its land back. Two wars were fought and Penn won. Vermont was still just a part of New York State. The Green Mountain Boys and other guerrillas were fighting for their independence. They didn't get it until after the Constitution. Ships exchanged gunfire on the Hudson between New York and New Jersey. You got an idea of what the hell's going on here? The British were salivating over upstate New York and the Northwest Territories with their Indian allies. The Spanish from Florida were invading Georgia from the south, and the Indians were invading Georgia from the west, and they were winning. There was clearly an economic depression, a horrible economic depression on top of everything else. There's a wonderful 36-page paper by Robert Brunner called, quote, "The Great American Depression of 1784 to 1787 and the Advent of Nationalism." Now, immediately after Yorktown, some people called for the creation of a much stronger central government. They were called Federalists. They included George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams and James Madison, among others. As usual, Hamilton took the lead. He published a pamphlet, The Continentalist, in 1782, immediately calling for a stronger government. Emblematic and probably the last straw for the Articles was Shay's Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786. Shay, like many other soldiers, was promised a generous pension when the war ended. They got nothing. There's a great book called The War Men about Shay and other veterans. Worse yet, they had their farms taken away from them from failure to pay back taxes. Shay's Rebellion took over all of Western Massachusetts and held it for a while. They were later put down. Even Hamilton, the ultimate advocate for strong central government, had great sympathy. In October 1786, James Madison visited George Washington privately, found him very sympathetic. As always, and we've learned more about Washington and many of these guys just in the last 50 years, Washington was totally silent in public. Streams of important people flocked to Mount Vernon in 1785 and 1786 to visit George Washington. In a private letter from George Washington to John Jay, boy, he could keep his secrets, George, and he trusted the right people. We didn't find out about this till the 1980s. We have a private letter from George Washington to John Jay with a quote, 13 sovereignties pulling against each other will soon bring ruin to the whole. Another private letter, quote, "We are either a united people or we are not. If not, let us no longer act a farce by pretending to it." The only thing everybody agreed on was something had to be done. We were collapsing. We were descending into civil war, disunion. We were going to be recolonized by people. So the 1786 Annapolis Convention was called ostensibly to work on the true fact, that Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia and Delaware all claimed the Chesapeake and they were fighting. But it was a rare event in that many colonies were there together at the same time. At the end, John Dickinson recognized Alexander Hamilton in the back of the room. Hamilton moved that they meet again in Philadelphia in May 1787 to amend or repeal the Articles of Confederation. I'm going to stop us here. What? What the fuck? What? That would be no different than if someone proposed at the end of the State of the Union address that they meet in May to amend or repeal the Constitution. Most people thought they were only going to amend the articles, but they were very, very uncomfortable. This was very unpopular in general. And of course, the people running the convention in Philadelphia, they wanted to get the most popular people to attend. So among the people they approached were two of the leaders of the revolution and two of the most popular people and greatest orators of the day. First, Samuel Adams in Massachusetts. No, I'm not coming. Even more amazing and important, the number one king of oratory, Patrick Henry. The second most famous quote from Patrick Henry after "Give me liberty or give me death." Patrick Henry, quote, "I smell a rat in Philadelphia. I fought against one form of tyranny. I will not replace it with another." He was against it before, didn't go. He was against it during. He was against it after the convention. He spoke out. There's a good reason why Virginia is the 10th state. Out of the 13 nation states, due to Patrick Henry and some others at the House of Burgesses, Virginia was the 10th state out of 13 to ratify this thing that came out of Philadelphia. Now, who was going to this meeting in Philadelphia? Today, we'd call them the 1%, the richest, best educated, most conservative, most establishment people in the colonies. Only two delegations showed up on time, Pennsylvania and Virginia. Ben Franklin walked the large Pennsylvania delegation down the street. Virginia arrived well prepared with a large delegation, including George Washington and James Madison. They came with a very detailed and elaborate plan. It was called the Virginia Plan, largely crafted by James Mason. It would dominate the early stages of the meeting. It favored the large and populous states. Now, George Washington, on his arrival to Philadelphia, rhetorical question, who was the first person George Washington went to see when he got close to Philadelphia? I don't have time to get a live answer, so I'll answer it. Big Ben, Benjamin Franklin. Ben showed him the 24-seat dining room he had added to his house. After the City Tavern, Ben's house was the number one hangout during the whole convention. Ben was 81 and suffered from gout and old age. Many people, including some historians, have underestimated the crucial role he played at the Constitutional Convention. After hours, people could relax and Franklin could work on good fellowship and compromise with people who had spent the whole day screaming and cursing at each other. Key deals were brokered under the mulberry bush in his yard where people went off to the side. There's actually some paintings of people talking under the mulberry bush. At their very first meeting, Washington and Ben agreed that Washington would be president and Ben would nominate him. We're going in with huge problems to this meeting in Philadelphia. The big states versus the small states. The people who wanted a strong central government to people who wanted a weak central government, or people who wanted nothing but just make some changes to the articles. Slavery hung over the whole meeting like a dark cloud. As agreed by Franklin and Washington, Washington is immediately elected president, and immediately they have a total secrecy rule. Total secrecy rule. They agreed to something that was really would have called the people outside to go nuts. They were going to replace the articles. They immediately agreed to it in total secrecy. The windows were all bolted shut. The doors were locked. A 4-month ordeal in a very stuffy and hot room. If you've seen it, as I have many times, you will know it was not a very large space. Now, there soon will be a replica in Philadelphia. COVID kind of interfered with this project we're working on. A replica of the sedan chair that Ben Franklin used to enter every day. If you can put your memory back to Cleopatra and have her coming in, sitting on a throne or a chair 5 feet above the ground in a beautiful enclosure like a carriage, and 2 12-foot poles on either side of her, and 4 giants carrying her in. That's how Ben Franklin arrived. The man who knew drama, the man who knew how to influence people. That's how he arrived every day. Again, he was 81 years old. He was not well, and he was a great actor and the king of all media. And he had gout at least. He was to die of natural causes 3 years later. Now, I can't emphasize enough, and how Franklin played this like a fiddle. Nobody wanted to kill Ben Franklin. Nobody, but nobody. I'll get into this later, but you cannot overestimate the reputation, the deference, the status that Franklin had, not just in America, but in all of Europe. Nobody wanted to kill Ben Franklin. He used this device many times to stop people from walking out of the convention. Rutledge started walking out several times. Immediately, Franklin says, "Oh, my heart, my heart. Oh. Rutledge comes back. "Please, Mr. Franklin, please. Mr. Rutledge, will you just sit down again? Can we just talk?" "Oh, yes, Dr. Franklin. Oh, yes. Oh, I'm going to go in now to why Franklin is head and shoulders above even George Washington at this point in time in 1787. Franklin had lived in London from 1757 to 1775, 18 years. He was a member of the Royal Society. He was the first non-British person to be awarded an honorary doctorate from Oxford. Oxford had existed for 400 years already. Only non-British person to receive. The King George III wouldn't bother to meet with a savage like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or any of these punks. Franklin was received at court and received by the highest societies in England for 18 years. And of course, he'd received honorary doctorates, not just from Harvard and Yale and William and Mary and these country schools, but from Oxford and Cambridge and virtually every major university in Europe. Walter Isaacson has only written 3 biographies in his Genius series, and he may never write another one. There are only 3 biographies in his Genius series. The first one, Leonardo da Vinci. The second one, Albert Einstein. I'm sure the crowd can tell me who the third one is. A very good biography, Benjamin Franklin. Now, things had gotten so bad, they started in mid-May. By June 11th, Franklin was so appalled, and the hatred and the argument and the debate had gotten so hot and so vicious that he had a statement read for him. He was not faking it. He was now too ill to stand at this point. So here's a quick Franklin quote. Quote, "We are sent here to consult, not to contend with each other. A declaration of a fixed opinion and a determined resolution never to change your opinion neither enlightens nor convinces us." Boy, we should put this in front of every controversial room and put it on the wall. He was begging them to stop engaging in violent quarrels and try to compromise. The New York delegation, 3 people, including Hamilton, had walked out in early July. No one knew it at the time, but they were the only state to do this. There could have been more states that would have walked out. Things were in a horrible condition. Rhode Island never showed up and never attended. George Washington had not said one word from the podium yet. The silence of George Washington. We just discovered this in the 20th century, but he wrote a private letter to his closest intimate advisor who was away, Alexander Hamilton, on July 11th. Quote, "Please come back. Please come back. Please come back. If anything, things have gotten even worse." And here is the quote that should be all in capitalized from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton. "I regret ever having had any agency in this business at all. I regret ever having had any agency in this business at all." George Washington thought it was going to be a disaster. He's regretted even sharing it. We get into competing plans. Good old Jersey boys. The New Jersey plan came out favoring the small states in opposition to the Virginia plan, which favored the large states. Debates about the executive and the legislative were on and on with many suggestions. Ben Franklin had been president of Pennsylvania. President of Pennsylvania served by popular election every year, and there was only one house that was elected popularly every year. No other colony had that type of government. Ben Franklin wanted the US to have that kind of government. I would give that government 10 or 15 years at the most. Can you imagine? President elected by popular vote every year, and a Congress, one house, elected by popular vote every year. And he also thought about maybe we should have 2 or 3 co-presidents. Some proposed unlimited 6 or 7 year presidential terms with reelection. Some proposed 1 6-year term for president. And I presented to you guys, those of you who remember it, a presentation called 1 6-year term for president. Why not? It would be much better than the current system that we have, but unfortunately, it's just an academic exercise. Gouverneur Morris, a great founding father, he pushed that idea. Most people don't know it, but he gave the eulogy at Hamilton's funeral. More trivia. Then the final compromise began to take form. It was called the Connecticut Compromise in mid-July. We're really putting together a document that begins to look a lot like, can you see me? This thing, the Constitution. House elected by popular vote every 2 years. The Senate was originally appointed by state legislatures for 6-year terms until 1913. James Madison quote on the Senate, quote, "They ought to be so constructed as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. The Senate ought to be this body. They ought to have permanency and stability." They immediately set it up that the 6-year terms of senators were immediately staggered. So you'd have 1/3 of them elected every 2 years for some sense of stability. Also remember, the vast majority of the population were illiterate and poorly educated. Mob rule was a large concern. And of course, we ended up with a president elected every 4 years. Now, who was the man behind the Connecticut Compromise? Roger Sherman proposed it and was the public face of it, but he didn't have the power, not even close. Who was the power behind the Connecticut Compromise, the final Constitution? Big Ben, Benjamin Franklin. I'm going to give you a quote from Carl Van Doren's 1939 Pulitzer Prize winning epic biography of Franklin. Quote, "This is Ben's great victory in the convention. He was the chief author of the compromise." Everyone was disappointed in aspects of the final result. George Washington and James Madison proposed the Supremacy Clause, proposed power of the federal government to veto any state legislations. It was proposed and voted down 3 times. Many things were voted down many times. As the convention neared its end, the states' writers put in the enumerated clause under Article 1 of the Constitution. 7 things under Article 1. It might seem to imply that these were the only powers the federal government would have. However, James Wilson and the Federalists put in Article 1, Section 8, which you've heard me say before, quote, "To make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any other department or officer thereof." I'm going to say that again. Article 1, Section 8, "To make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States or any other department or officer thereof." You look to the Constitution, and the next sentence, they immediately begin forbidding states to do what they used to do: printing money, raising armies, signing treaties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, under George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, and under John Marshall as Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835, the elastic clause of a necessary and proper clause became the cornerstone for the constitutionality of much of the federal power today. Now, if you want one book on the Constitutional Convention, the go-to book on the Constitutional Convention when I was a freshman at Columbia in 1967 was Catherine Drinker Bowen's Miracle at Philadelphia. It seems to be the go-to book even today. So if you want to book up on it, Miracle at Philadelphia, great read. There are lots of issues, of course. Slavery, they pretty much punted on slavery. As a sop to the abolitionists, the international slave trade was to be illegal after 1808, 20 years. It was almost impossible to enforce anyway. Now, the southern states had a much smaller population than the North, and in the Constitution, we have the infamous 6/10 or 60% rule. Quote unquote, other people, which meant slaves, were to be counted in the census as 60% of a human being to increase representation in the slave states. A few days after drafting the compromise, Ben invited Eldridge Gerry of Massachusetts, a leading open and vocal opponent of this Philadelphia thing, for tea in his garden. Ultimately, Gerry would refuse to sign, but here, Franklin persuaded Eldridge Gerry to stop opposing it loudly and or publicly and or openly. Let's talk about the Electoral College for a while. In 1787, nobody expected political parties. Nobody expected a two-party system. Parties or mobs or factions were to be avoided at all costs. It was assumed that individuals would run for president and be voted upon for president in the Electoral College. It was not expected that any one candidate would even get 50% of the vote. Let's just go to 1796. John Adams was elected president and Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. He was elected vice president because he got the second most votes in the Electoral College. They ran against each other. They were the two opposing candidates. Can you imagine in the election of 2020 that Joe Biden would be president and the vice president would be Donald Trump? That was the system. So even in 1796, we had degenerated into a two-party system. Now, as we got very close to the end, it became clear that the vast majority would sign. At the very end, there were 42 people present. During the entire 4 months, there seldom were more than 45 people there at one time. After 4 long months locked up in a hot room, they were exhausted and dying just to get out and go home. Wow, how timely can this get? After a year of COVID-19, boy, can we relate to that. Can you relate to that? That you just want to get out? These people had it. It was going to end. They were done. However, it would mean nothing, absolutely nothing, if it were not ratified by at least 9 of the 13 nation states. At the convention, Franklin spent all his efforts and energies trying to get as close to 100% vote as possible. The rules were changed. A person did not sign as an individual, but only as a member from his state. This gave political cover for people who were signing a document they knew was very unpopular back home. Now I'm going to quote one of the greatest speeches, probably in the English language, which is constantly quoted, Franklin's closing argument. Quote, "I confess that I do not entirely approve this Constitution at present, but sir, I am not sure I shall never approve it. Most men, most sects in religion think themselves in possession of all truth. The Romish Church, which is what they called the Roman Catholic Church in those days, is infallible. The Church of England is never in the wrong. I agree to this Constitution with all its faults, if there are any, because I think a general government necessary for us. Thus, I consent, sir, to this Constitution because I expect no better and because I am not sure it is not the best." What a masterpiece. What a masterpiece. Most historians agree that the reason the American Revolution succeeded and the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution failed was this. All 3 revolutions were well justified. The French Revolution and the Russian Revolution began with moderate and reasonable governance and governing, the Girondist and the Kerensky government. However, rather quickly, the most violent and extreme elements hijacked the other 2 revolutions. By 1792, you had the Reign of Terror in France, and very quickly the Bolsheviks in Russia. After a brief period of anarchy, you went back to total dictatorship, Napoleon and Stalin. The 1787 Constitution really was a conservative counter-reaction to the anarchy that was the American Revolution and followed the American Revolution itself. No Sam Adamses, no Patrick Henrys, no firebrands. It is very rare to excel at being a soldier and a revolutionary and a governor and an administrator and a nation builder all in one. George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and many others had all those abilities. I'll reemphasize it. The Constitution was a massive series of compromises. No one got anything near what they wanted. The only 3 major people who refused to sign, every one of them, wrote public apologies to Benjamin Franklin. All. Sorry, Dr. Franklin, I apologize, giving you the power and prestige and status of Benjamin Franklin. Eldridge Gerry and Randolph and George Mason all wrote public apologies to Dr. Franklin. So only 3 people out of the 42 did not sign. Now, Patrick Henry immediately labeled this Philadelphia document, Philadelphia toilet paper. And I'm sure he said harsher things than that. And he was out there against it all the time, and many people were against it. It was not popular. The future Confederates learned a lot from the Federalists of 1787 and 1788. They immediately began a brilliant campaign. The ratifying state conventions were not to be held in the state capital. George Clinton, governor of New York, and the Clinton machine pulled their whole delegation out of the convention. The state governments didn't want this thing to come into existence or to have too much power. This Constitution gave it way too much power than they wanted. So the state conventions were not held in the state capitals. Just like in 1860, they were not held in the state capitals. And the percentage of delegates associated with existing states' government was minimized in both cases. Nevertheless, Hamilton realized he would need to write a series of detailed and descriptive articles to the public to convince the public and the 13 nation states that they should ratify this thing. Federalist number 1 and Federalist number 2 were written in October 1787, 1 month after the convention, by Hamilton alone. They were addressed to the people of the state of New York only. Then he realized he would need help. He recruited John Jay, who wrote 5, and Madison, who wrote 29. Hamilton alone wrote 59 of the 85 Federalist paper articles. He decided who was to write on what subject. He delegated virtually all the papers on Congress to Madison. He wrote virtually all the papers on the executive and the judiciary. They wrote 85 dense, brilliant articles in 9 months. Okay, I got your attention. If you will only remember one short Q&A in the entire 85 Federalist Papers essays, for me, this is it. This is an elegant answer to the huge question: why have governments been instituted at all? You can say that to yourself. I'm going to say it again. Why have governments been instituted at all? That is inside Federalist 15 by Alexander Hamilton. And he answers his rhetorical question. Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraint. I'm going to say it again. Because the passions of men will not conform to the dictates of reason and justice without constraints. Hamilton always knew human beings are not rational animals. Sooner or later, their emotions, envy, greed, hatred, lust, wishful thinking, prejudice, ignorance, on and on, sooner or later, reason will be overpowered. Basically, human beings are not capable of rational self-government over the long run. I'm going to repeat that again. Human beings are not capable of rational self-government over the long run, especially in groups or mobs of societies or countries. That isn't going to make you popular, but that is a fact. And Hamilton grew up under mob rule in Nevis and St. Croix. The founders gave us a government of laws, not a government of men. That is the genius that has allowed this Constitution to be the ultimate law of the land since 1789. Another Hamilton quote from the Federalist, quote, "Give all power to the few and they will oppress the many. Give all power to the many and they will oppress the few." What is the number one source the Supreme Court has looked to over the last 200 years to determine for them what the Constitution really means? Not even close. The Federalist Papers. I read one source that cited they had used it 291 times as a reference by 2000. Big Ben walked out of the convention. He was famously asked, "Well, Dr. Franklin, what have you given us? A republic or a monarchy?" "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." What wisdom, what brilliance. Now, as of December 1787, only 3 states had ratified Philadelphia toilet paper. So in the first 3 months, they got Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. What do they have in common? They're all within 15 miles of Philadelphia. Immediately, a 4th came along, and that was Georgia. Why? Georgia was being invaded from the south by Spain, and the Indians and the natives by the south and west. They were losing. They were willing to join anything that would help them survive. Then there were 6 months of silence and standoff. The basic issue is what we now call the Bill of Rights. Once enough Federalists solemnly promised to add something like that to the Constitution, Massachusetts became the 5th state to ratify the Constitution. After that, they quickly advanced to New Hampshire, becoming the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, making it official. Ironically, New York and Virginia, the home states of both Madison and Hamilton, were huge holdouts. Only after New Hampshire made it number 9, they didn't have a lot of choice, Virginia made it 10 and New York made it 11, still by very close votes. It was not until after George Washington was sworn in that North Carolina became number 12. Rhode Island basically ratified at the point of a gun in 1791. They were the smallest and the wealthiest state. I'm not going with a big ending. I'm just going to stop here and open it up for questions.
Raise your hands as necessary. You know how to do it. And I'll unmute you as you come along. Bill Tittle first.
Okay, Nolan, thank you very much. Lovely talk. Just a little detailed question. You were rattling off the order of the ratification, and I wrote down Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, the first 3, Georgia is the 4th, and all of a sudden,
Massachusetts was the 5th. I don't know if I can recite them all from memory, but that's what's important. Massachusetts became the 5th. After that, 6, 7, 8, and 9, there was a 6-month lull. I'll go again, give you a quick videotape replay. After they left in September 1787, 3 states quickly ratified it.
Right.
Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. They were all within 15 miles of Philadelphia. So they were the early big supporters. Then quickly, Georgia became number 4 for the survival reason that they were being conquered. Then you had 6 months of dead silence and deadlock.
Yeah.
And the rest of the states weren't willing to ratify this Philadelphia toilet paper until they got some assurances about individual liberties. And finally, they got what they considered a credit. People kept their word in those days, usually. So they got credible assurances they were going to get their Bill of Rights. So Massachusetts became number 5. After that, you can look up who's 6, 7, 8. New Hampshire was number 9. After New Hampshire, they had their 9 states. So the United States of America existed with 9 states, which bothered New York and Virginia so much that ironically, Hamilton's and Madison's home states were holdouts. That's why Virginia's 10 and New York is 11. Washington was inaugurated before North Carolina even became 12, and Rhode Island became 13 because they threatened to invade them and conquer them because they were the smallest and richest. Yeah, man. They were the smallest and richest colony. And so they ratified at the point of a gun.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Terrific.
John Tomaszewski.
Yeah.
Yes.
I heard a rumor that when they were putting this Constitution together, that nobody drank the water because it was usually very polluted, and that they usually drank whiskey, and so it really got to be fun by the end of the day. Is that a true statement?
That's absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. Nobody, well, put it like this. Nobody was having any fun in the meeting in Philadelphia downtown when they're yelling and screaming. When they got to Ben's hangout after hours, they were drinking and having fun, and he was trying to cajole them into, talking to each other and trying to compromise. Nobody drank water in the colonial times because it was so polluted and dirty and dangerous. Beer was the common drink. It was also, some people thought it a food, as I understand the history books. So people were drinking all the time, constantly. Nobody wanted to drink the water. Everybody was drinking some spirits, but there wasn't much fun being held inside the room where it happened.
Thanks. Great talk.
Miguel.
Yes, thank you. Nolan, it's great to have the opportunity to ask you questions, especially since you were there at those meetings.
Yeah. There was a story called Ben and Me. I was a little mouse. If you remember Disney.
My question is about the electors that you mentioned briefly. Were the electors expected to vote their own opinion for president and vice president, or were they sent charged with the vote? Were they an independent electoral body initially?
As usually, they were silent and they punted. It was unclear. But the whole idea of the Electoral College and the electors, there were not to be any political parties. You were supposed to vote for the most virtuous and honorable and honest and statesmanlike, I guess is the best word. You were supposed to vote for the most statesmanlike people. And there was no vote for president and vice president separately. I didn't make a point of that. But until the election of 1800 and the attempted coup by Aaron Burr, you voted for no distinction between president and vice president. So whoever got the most votes was president. Whoever got the second most votes was vice president. By 1796, you already had a two-party system. John Adams was elected president. Thomas Jefferson was elected vice president. They ran against each other. It would be exactly the same thing if in 2020, without the 12th Amendment, we would have President Joe Biden and Vice President Donald Trump. That was the original system. And of course, after Aaron Burr tried to steal the election of 1800, you look in the Constitution, the 12th Amendment originates separate voting for president and vice president. And the two-party system had already reared its ugly head, and it's had its ugly head up ever since.
So were the Bill of Rights adopted after the whole, everybody accepted, or
Yes.
were they part of the convention?
No. The Bill of Rights was amendments. They're the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. In September 1787, when they came out of Philadelphia, they just had the Constitution without any amendments. And 4 states, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Georgia, ratified it. But nobody touched it after that for 6 months, because Massachusetts and Sam Adams insisted, unless we get this Bill of Rights and these amendments, we're not ratifying this shit. And they believed them. They turned out to be telling the truth. And then Massachusetts said, okay, we ratify it. Then quickly, they got 6, 7, 8, 9. When Rhode Island ratified it, it then was a constitution for the United States of America. Does that clarify, I hope?
Yes, thank you.
Paul,
Yeah, maybe you made reference to this at the beginning. I was a little distracted there, but I Googled this and I found that there had never been a constitution like this written ever before. And of course, and so they were sort of inventing it all from scratch. It's no wonder they didn't know what to do and they couldn't agree. And also, every constitution that's been written since starts by looking at the original one, which was this one. And so it's had enormous impact in the world, not just in the United States. Would you agree with all that or add to it?
I'd agree with some of it. They did not go to Philadelphia with no idea what they were going to do. James Madison and George Washington, the Virginia Plan was a carefully constructed constitution before they ever got to Philadelphia. Lots of these people were geniuses. Lots of them, like a lot of the people I'm looking at right now, have pretty strong egos and have pretty strong ideas of how governance should be done. James Madison and Hamilton had studied every form of government they could find back to the Greeks and before. So they had the benefit of years of scholarship and study and intense preparation for this meeting. And they weren't the only ones that had made intense preparation. So they had a very good idea of what they wanted, but unfortunately, they did not agree on what they wanted. So they went to war with each other and hammered out all these compromises. No, there was never a comprehensive constitution for a complete form of governments like this before, but there were many, forms of government. There was the Roman Republic, as you heard a whole talk about. There were the Greeks. There was the Republic of Venice. The Republic of Venice existed from 800 AD to 1700 AD. They looked carefully at the Republic of Venice. Holland did not have a monarchy. They looked carefully at Holland. They looked carefully at Switzerland. So they looked carefully at everything they could think of that did not have a church or state tyranny. They had a PhD in government and civilization, and more importantly, in human nature before they got there.
Good.
Mike Martin?
Nolan, thanks for a provocative presentation. And it's always very interesting. 2 questions, one broad, one specific. Broad question, did the Congress that was under the Articles of Confederation have any role in the Constitution? Were the members of the constitutional participants members of the Congress under the Articles of Confederation, and specifically John Hanson? Did he have a role in any of this, who is theoretically the first president of the United States? And the second point I have, it's just picayune. The 6/10 vote for slaves, did that apply to indentured servants? Okay, thanks.
I don't believe so. I'm more certain about the answer to the first one. That's a trivia question. John Hanson was the first president of the Continental Congress. He was not the first president of the United States. There was no United States until we had the Constitution.
Okay,
They went out of their way, as I mentioned briefly. In 1860, the Confederates, to secede from the Union, got the brilliant idea from the Federalists. They didn't want anybody who was associated with the Articles of Confederation to be in Philadelphia. If they could get it to zero, they would have been very happy. Very, very, very few people who served in the Continental Congress attended the Constitutional Convention. And as I said, they went way out of their way. First of all, they didn't hold the meetings in the state capitals. The state governments and the state governors hated this thing. They would have killed it if they could. So they got away from the state governments. They got away from the state capitals. They got away from the Continental Congress, which was a useless piece of garbage, basically, for 6 years.
okay.
Okay.
Tom Pate, you're next. Unmute yourself.
Yes, I have, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Okay. Nolan, it's a point of curiosity that 3 states close to Philadelphia approved the Constitution very quickly. Was that related to Franklin's influence, or was there something else going on?
There were several things going on. Yes, it was partially because of Ben Franklin's influence, and he was a god, especially anywhere near Philadelphia. He was a total god. Also, of course, it's a simple matter of transportation and communication. These 3 states learned about this immediately. If you lived in South Carolina or some of the other colonies, you might not have heard of it for some time. But I think also philosophically, before they met in Philadelphia, people had a pretty good idea what was going to happen, what was coming. So I think New Jersey and Pennsylvania and Delaware were kind of simpatico about the matter.
Okay,
Thanks.
Poppy?
This is a great take on the Constitution. Could you tell me,
Speak up.
could you tell me how the US Constitution writing helped the world getting a democracy in place?
Can someone repeat? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you. Could someone?
How did it
repeat the
help the
question?
world?
Pardon?
How did it help the world?
Oh, it helped the world a lot. It helped the world a lot. I mean, this was the beginning of the end of absolute monarchies and absolute religious tyranny. The American Revolution was studied very closely, and France was our major ally. And the American Revolution certainly served as a template and a catalyst for the French Revolution. Washington was sworn in 1789. They stormed the Bastille in Paris in 1789. So there was a direct connection between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And then, of course, Napoleon spread the French Revolution all over Europe, not just through conquest, but it was a much more democratic approach than they had. So most people loved it. And of course, it spread even there. And of course, nobody, maybe only Alexander Hamilton thought we'd be sitting here 230 years later, the same country under the same constitution. If you would have polled the people in Philadelphia, he might have been the only one. Jefferson said it, and he wasn't even there, Jefferson, and he was bad-mouthing it the whole time. Jefferson said it might be good for 10 or 20 years. Most people expected, it's called an experiment, and it's still called an experiment by many people. It was thought of as an experiment, a wild, crazy, ambitious experiment. The consensus, I would say, would be they expected it to last for maybe 20 years on a good day. So as it lasted for 50 years, went through a massive civil war, continued to exist as Lincoln expounded it. And so the whole world was watching this experiment succeed. And so it was a big impetus for democracy in any way you want to talk about it.
In 1945 to 47, India wrote its constitution of democracy, and British were leaving, and India was looking for a constitution. It didn't use British constitution. It might have used the American constitution.
England does not have a constitution. England does not have a written constitution. Many countries use the American Constitution as the template or the model for their own constitution, for basically the reasons I mentioned. It has lasted, it's been durable. That nation ended up doing very well, thank you very much, from a little nothing in 1789 that didn't even matter, to this massive powerhouse. So for those reasons, it has been copied, it has been used as an example all over the world for at least 150 years, if not 200 years.
Thank you.
Alejo?
Nolan, a brilliant, insightful talk. I dubbed the Benjamin Franklin of the Summit Old Guard. It seems that one of the successes of the Constitution was that it could be evolved through amendments. Whose idea was it to allow the Constitution to be amended?
I don't have the exact quote, but I wish I did. I think I said that the necessary and proper clause was in, well, first of all, there was the Bill of Rights, which were the first 10 amendments to the whole idea that it could be amended. There's another guy who was at that meeting who didn't get enough credit, but John Marshall, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court from 1801 to 1835, handed down opinion after opinion after opinion, saying that this is a constitution that is designed for all the ages, to be amended to react to all the crises of human events. That isn't an exact quote, but that's what he meant. So he put it in concrete. He advocated it at the convention. They had the first 10 amendments, and very early in the 1800s, I don't know if it was in Marbury versus Madison or one of the epic Supreme Court decisions in either 1803 or 1807, a lawyer here might do better at this, but he was really the driving force to make a flexible constitution, and make amendments expected.
Thank you.
Ken Lindhorst?
Hi, thanks for a wonderful history lesson. When I think of the Constitution, I really think of it in two pieces. The one you described, and the other, the Bill of Rights and the amendments. And it's really a balance between the power of the federal government versus the power of the people and the states. And to me, that's why it works. And I wish you'd talk a little bit about how the Bill of Rights ended up being what it is. I understand it was something Massachusetts required, but how did they get the first 10 amendments?
Well, as I said, they only could get four
who
states to
did
ratify.
it? Who wrote it?
Sorry.
Who did it? Who wrote it? I mean, it just didn't come out of the heavens. Somebody had to put together the thought process of delivering a balanced approach.
Mm-hmm. One of the three people who refused to sign the Constitution and attended it was George Mason, who was an incredible figure of law. And he had written part of the Virginia Constitution. They had some rights in the Virginia Constitution. George Mason insisted that there be rights to the people. But before he would sign it, he did not sign it. He wrote an apology letter to Benjamin Franklin, trying to apologize and explain why he just couldn't sign the thing. There were concepts, obviously. I mean, they had studied the Enlightenment thinkers. They had studied John Locke. They had studied all the Enlightenment thinkers. John Locke talked about life, liberty, and property. In 1776, Thomas Jefferson just made a very slight amendment, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So they were heavily influenced. I'd say John Locke more than anybody else, because he died in the 1720s or 30s. He was not that ancient to them. There were thinkers in the Enlightenment that espoused all these things.
There were a lot of thinkers, but who put it all together? Who wrote it?
Oh, James Madison. Okay. They wanted a Bill of Rights. They originally, Madison on the floor of the Congress proposed 12 amendments, not 10. So in 1790, they sent about debating like crazy these 12 amendments. And through compromise, the great compromise that made the Constitution, tons of compromises, we ended up with the 10 amendments that 2/3 of both houses passed and the president signed. And then Massachusetts said, okay, it's good enough for us. And they quickly went, after a 6-month delay, from 5 signers to 9 signers, and it was a done deal.
By the way, Marbury versus Madison established the principle that the Supreme Court had the ultimate authority for interpretation of the Constitution.
Thank you.
Mitch,
Thank you.
Hey,
Thank you.
Nolan, 2 things. First of all, you mentioned that beer was considered a food back in that day. And to this day, in Bavaria, it's legally a food, which means there's no minimum beer drinking age in Bavaria. Little piece of trivia. And a suggestion following on what Ken just said, maybe sometime you could present on the Bill of Rights, because I think that's a whole nother topic that deserves not only just the formulation and passage, but also subsequent history. Just a suggestion, just put it in your
Well, as you know, I hate to talk, especially uninterrupted for long periods of time. Anybody who knows me knows just what a sacrifice that would be. So if you want to talk on the Bill of Rights, I could think of putting one together. As you know, I'm going to open my mouth in May and only talk about saving the human race. If anybody wants to save the human race, tune in May. Steve is my co-conspirator. He's smiling.
Okay, well, we got monthly program chairs out there. Take that hint, call up Nolan and ask him for some month later on.
Yeah, well, years and years ago, when a lot of speakers didn't show up, it was Phil Eisner and myself were kind of always in the bullpen. And if a speaker didn't show up, we both agreed we would run up and talk, which I did 2 times. So it's not hard to get up. I don't know if I have more than a half an hour on the Bill of Rights, but maybe I'll think on it.
Okay. Especially if you go into the subsequent history and controversies and so forth. And just for everybody's notification, Steve Varley does in fact have some secret standby speakers in case we have a no-show of a speaker. So that little secret still exists. Okay, I'm done.
with that in mind, Steve Varley, it's your turn.
Well, good morning, Nolan, and thank you for your usual tour de force. It was just great. Based upon what you said and my own recollection of the Federalist Papers, it seems that our founders had a real fear, or at least a great concern, about majority rule unless it was carefully constrained. Is that a correct interpretation?
Absolutely. I tried to stress that, but I made so many big dramatic points I thought were most important. That's a biggie. They feared mob rule above all things. Majority rule for them was mob rule. Hamilton grew up in the Caribbean. He witnessed rape, murder, pillage. He witnessed mobs roaming the streets. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress was stormed by troops 3 times while they were in Philadelphia. 90% of the population was illiterate. Yes, they had a tremendous fear of what they called mob rule. They did not want majority rule. That was what they were trying to avoid. All throughout history, they went back and they'd studied how all these revolutions had gone wrong due to anarchy and mob rule. So that was totally intentional. Senators were not elected. They were appointed by state legislatures till 1913 because of a constitutional amendment in 1913, for example. Yes, they feared and wanted to avoid majority rule, which they called mob rule. In a way, maybe it is. I don't know.
Thank you.
Jim Blinn?
Yes, Nolan. Thank you very much for that talk. You said that the members of the convention did not want the state government people to be the ones to be voting to ratify it. So the question is, how did the people get chosen who were the ones in some particular state to do the ratification, and why was that accepted?
Well, you had a lot of I'll go to current events very briefly to make my point, and I'm going to go away from there. Everybody was upset with the primaries. Why does some state have a different primary than other states? The Republican Party is a private club. They can make up any rules they want. So basically, you had a conspiracy, actually. It was a private club. You had to be invited to join the Mickey Mouse Club. You weren't in the Constitutional Convention Mickey Mouse Club unless you got invited by the Mickey Mouse Club. Who were the founding three people of the Mickey Mouse Club? Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Dickinson. And they wanted someone to come from every colony, and they wanted the most popular people. They wanted Patrick Henry to come. I told you his reply. We have an unquotable reply from Sam Adams. So it was a club. It was a private club. They had no authority. They weren't a government entity. They weren't part of anything. They were just a meeting. They were just a convention. And they made sure it didn't mean shit unless 9 of the 13 nation states ratified it. So they weren't really officially forming a country or a government. They were proposing one.
Yeah, but my question was, so it wasn't accepted until 9 of the states had ratified it, but how did the people in the states who were going to vote on ratification get selected?
That was another private club business. That was another private. The Confederacy did the same thing if you study it. The Confederacy never met in the state capitals to secede from the Union. They had separate meetings. These guys had separate meetings. In every state, future state, they had separate meetings, and they controlled who was invited. Patrick Henry was not invited to the ratification meeting in Virginia. He wasn't even allowed to show up. You know, he would barge in and make speeches, and everybody would have their minds changed, and it would never get done. But they tightly controlled who was in attendance, especially in Philadelphia, but in every state ratification. And you'll see the same thing in 1860 and 61. In every state ratification, the group that met was a private group. It was not the state government. And most of the state government people were not there. Kind of a coup, in a way.
Well, that's what it sounds like, because
Kind
it
of.
wasn't
Yeah.
the official people who were running the state who said, okay, that sounds good, we'll join that. Instead, it was some other group of people who apparently were friends of the people that were in the Constitutional Convention who got asked to vote on it.
And of course, they were great propagandists. We, the people of the United States of America, in order to form a more perfect union. Do you know what the original draft said? We, the people of the United States of Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Yes, sir. The first draft read that way. And they said, we ain't talking about that. They had no official power, so they weren't an official organization. But with a velvet glove and the consent of nine conventions, they created a constitution for the United States of America. You know, there's always a little bit of some dirty hands on people who have revolutions and who make major changes. There's always a little bit of dirt under the fingernails.
You don't want to see sausage being made, I guess. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ron Hoke?
Thanks again, Nolan. This was really an interesting talk. The thing that intrigues me is that something that today seems to us to be a natural thing to do for any organization, to set up a series of rules and laws before the organization gets underway, so that they know how to proceed, what the rules are, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing that intrigued me was the fact that this was such a revolutionary idea at the time. And governments had been set up for centuries, and nobody seemed to have thought of the idea until this small group of people in one part of the world came up with what now seems to be the only reasonable way to start a government or any organization. What were the roots of this concept that seemed to be developed by this small group of people? Where did they get these ideas? Were there any historical precedents that indicated to them that this was something that should be done, something that now seems so natural?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and others, there are other geniuses walking the rooms here. They had studied every possible form of an entity that governed without a king or a religious monopoly. Venice had been a republic for almost 1,000 years. They studied the Swiss, they studied the Dutch, they studied the Venetians, they studied the Greek city-states and the glory days of Greece. They studied everything they could get their hands on. And they had the Enlightenment thinkers, John Locke first and foremost. There had been a lot written during the Enlightenment. There had been a lot written during the Renaissance about all these ideas of individual liberty, individual freedom, fair and safe government, no absolute monarchs. These ideas had been tried and put forward at various places and times. And so they had studied it very carefully. Now, when they got into Philadelphia, I might not have emphasized this enough, they had only 2 rules when they started their meeting. George Washington is in charge and total secrecy, lock the doors, lock the windows. If anybody finds out what we're doing, they'll probably lynch us, basically.
So this is one of the benefits of the idea of starting with a clean piece of paper and starting all over again to put together something that had never been done before.
Yes, I think so. I imagine there must have been attempts to do this. They just never lasted very long. I'm sure you probably had some wonderful documents written up to be the government of XYZ, whether it's one canton in Switzerland or someplace. They probably had tried this, I imagine, before. It just never had gotten anywhere at all before.
Thank you. Thank you. Very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Mitch?
Yeah, Nolan, just to follow up on Ron's question just now, was it an absolute 100% given that we would not be a monarchy? I knew they hated King George, but was it absolutely 100% that there would be no monarchy when they went into this?
Absolutely 300%. They had just fought an 8-year war. I didn't emphasize it enough. I'll emphasize it again. 1% of the population was killed during an 8-year Revolutionary War against King George, against the monarchy. Everybody agreed in capital letters, no monarchy, no kings. Most of the people didn't like this Philadelphia toilet paper. This was too close to central control for their taste. If you took a poll of the average person, I would bet large money, the majority would say this is too much power to the central government.
Okay, no. Just asking.
No, it's cool. All questions are good questions.
Anybody else have any questions? If not, let me turn it over to Jay.
No, that was a fascinating speech. It's incredible to learn. I have one quick question though before we finish, and that is, how long did it take them to write out the Constitution and send it to different people around to have it approved? It seems to me by hand, it would take a day or two, or maybe a week before it could be presented. Is that true?
Yeah. They started around mid-May. Yeah. Around mid-July, they were coming close to the final agreed document. They were probably arguing up until the very last day about some. Matter of fact, I know they changed one picayune rule to get one guy to vote for it. I forget. Washington said, okay, we'll change the number from 40,000 to 41,000. Oh, but to actually write it out and write it down probably was a 2 or 3 day process. By September 13th, I believe they had it and people began reading it and signing it in blood. This is it, you know. Oh. And September 17th, they published it. They probably had it all signed, written, and done around September 13th. They probably didn't start, probably not until early September. Again, it was secret. The 2 rules, total secrecy. Some of this stuff has leaked out, but a lot of what happened at the Constitutional Convention has never been leaked out. Like, I don't know the exact day they began, okay, Joe, you're going to draft up the final piece of paper and have it signed. By then it was all over. Might have been September 1st, might have been September 5th, I would guess. Might have been September 10th. Nah, before September 10th.
But then all the copies had to be done again and distributed to the various states and so forth.
Yes, and I'm glad to talk about that because the first reading of the Declaration of Independence in New York City was July 9th. So even to
Wow.
get a written copy to a very, very advanced place like New York City, not that far away, and to have it read in public took 5 days. That I know, so you can extrapolate relativities to every other place you can think of.
Well, as you know, it's that was a fascinating talk, and it's customary to present you with a certificate for your wonderful talk.
There.
Oh,
Got it.
okay, there it is. Good.
Okay.
I don't have to tell you what the ORCID stands for, of summit, so forth. And I think I'll just make it short by saying, let's give him the home guard salute. Thanks, Nolan. I'm sure we'll see you again.
Thank you.